Hello, class. This is Mr. Howard. Giving you another lecture on the last section of Chapter 3, dealing specifically with um, the wealth of nations. The wealth of nations. This here. All right. Now, when we're talking about the wealth of nations, this is where we begin to see how industries throughout the world have obviously developed over time. But we also have begun to see how there is this underlying question of who exactly makes the choices or decisions as to how these resources are allocated globally. How are they divided? How is labor divided? How are these things regulated? In terms of regulation, what type of system of economic regulation is in place within each country? Is the country a capitalist society? Is it socialist? Is it a mixed economical system? So we're going to kind of unpack some of these elements in this section. Now, the Earth's resources are neither unlimited nor evenly divided amongst the nations. I think we all can agree to that. All right, so this is where we have to engage into an active study of the process by which people and countries make economic decisions. Well, these are called this is called economics. So make sure you highlight that. All right, when you're talking about economics, this is where we really are beginning to assess how these countries, respectively, handle their affairs. All right. Obviously, from biblical context, the Creator owns all of the earth's resources. Mankind, us, we're just simply stewards over the blessings that God has bestowed upon us. All right. We've been placed in charge of God's creation to use and develop its resources entirely for His glory. This is echoing back to chapter 1 dealing with the creation mandate. Make sure you remember that. Now, every system for making economic decisions should be evaluated in light of this truth. In other words, this is our worldview, all right? That God is obviously the creator of all things, He's the creator of mankind. Therefore, mankind is simply a steward or manager or overseer over those creations, over those blessings by God. All right. The governments of the world generally have economic systems that can be classified as either capitalist, socialist, or mixed economies. Make sure you highlight all three. Make sure you write those down in your notes, as well as the definition of the term economics. You will need to know that. Now let's transition into capitalism. Now, when we're talking about capitalism, one of the main societies that is very gung ho about capitalism is obviously the United States of America. All right. In fact, most Western countries, including America, follow a system of capitalism. All right. But before we get into capitalism, let's look at what is capital. Okay. So when we're talking about capital, we're referring to the money and equipment, such as buildings, tools, computers, vehicles, etc., that are necessary in order to build industries. All right. This is capital. All right. So make sure you mark that down. Now, private individuals or corporations usually build most industries, risking their own capital by making investments in hopes of making a profit. Now, these individuals obviously would really be referred to as entrepreneurs. All right, so make sure you highlight the people who take risks in order to kind of start businesses, in order and risk their own capital by making investments in order to have a return on their investment in the form of profit. They are called entrepreneurs. We saw examples of this when we began watching a documentary on men who built America. All right. But in order to look at how this capitalistic economy is structured, it is also referred to as a free market. Make sure you highlight free market, all right, and write that down because businesses freely compete in the marketplace for buyers with little interference from the government. All right. In fact, the interference is so minimal until, in all actuality, this is really what makes the United States such a rare case when you're talking about capitalism and how we've been able to really increase our gross domestic product and our price per capita, which we'll kind of unpack those terms later, over time. Okay. And it's because of this free market structure that America has really been able to really move forward at a rapid rate over the past few centuries. All right. So make sure you write that down. Okay. Now let's get into socialism. Now, during the 19th century, opponents of capitalism developed an alternative system called socialism. Now, make sure you write this down in your notes, the definition of socialism, which is the government. This is where the government pretty much owns the major industries and promises to make production decisions for the welfare of society. We saw examples of this actually in America. It wasn't socialism, it just had elements of a socialist influence. When you're talking about the bailout for the banks in 2007 and 2008, all right, this concept where the government had to really intervene in order to kind of get these industries back up and running, all right, and temporarily make certain decisions, during that time period was somewhat of a socialist move. All right. So that would be an example of how socialism or socialist tendencies can still have moments where it's present in different economic structures, all right, such as the United States and capitalism. Make sure you highlight socialism as also being known as a command economy because it allows the government to do three things. Number one, determine which industries are developed. Number two, where the industries are built. And number three, what the industries actually produce. Okay. Now, this is very important. This is where the term command economy comes in because truly the government is in command. All right. It is not dispersed in terms of the levels of responsibility and power to privatize risk takers in the form of entrepreneurs within a free market, such as a capitalist society. This is where the government really has control over most of the major industries. Now, obviously, the most extreme form of socialism will be known as communism. All right. Make sure you write that down, under which the government owns everything. They make all economic decisions amongst all industrial companies throughout their respective country. All right. Now, the number of socialist governments dramatically increased in the first half of the 20th century. Make sure you highlight the 20th century. All right. But this is where we begin to see progressive levels of corruption amongst these leaders as they begin to look out their own privatized interests as at the expense of other citizens. Okay. Now, one thing I want to kind of, inject within this argument is when you're talking about both systems, communism and socialism, they both ignore God, all right? And they assume that an elite or an elitist group or an oligarch or oligarchy is better able to assess what is best for the people, all right, as opposed to the individuals themselves. And let me also echo this sentiment that these individuals are also responsible for electing these elitist um, leaders who make these decisions for themselves and not necessarily for the people and on behalf of the people who elect them into power. All right, so it's something to bear in mind. Now, when we're talking about mixed economies, this is where we see mainly between 1989 and 1991, this is where socialist governments began to fall like dominoes in Eastern Europe, especially the Soviet Union. All right, this is where socialist countries they really begin to fall out of favor with the people, and people begin to rebel. This is where we see the 1988 Berlin Wall, that whole element unfolding. We see the Soviet Union beginning to lose its grip, all right, on not only their country, but their prominence within the global marketplace. All right, so socialist countries that have not fallen nonetheless experience problems that are inherent to such an economy. Now, what this means is that even though they're still intact, they're barely intact. All right. And as a result, they still are functioning, but they're not functioning at a healthy level. All right. So most of those countries whose socialist economies collapsed adopted a mixed economy. They didn't want to fully abandon a socialist economic system, but they wanted to kind of combine it with a capitalist system as well to kind of create a hybrid so that private citizens can own property and businesses, but the government closely regulated their choices as well as their methods of operation. All right. Now, in spite of socialism's poor record, even some leaders in capitalist countries have sought to move towards mixed economies, which there's actually elements of both entities that have a lot of positives. When brought together, it can kind of reduce the negatives of both when they're both immersed into a mixed economic structure. Now, how do companies, or not really companies, but countries, I should say, measure wealth? Now, this may shock you, but oftentimes when we think about wealth, we always think about money, right? Well, money has an element to it. It has its place, but it's not all. It's not all things when you're talking about wealth. Most people think of wealth as the ownership of things such as cattle, land, and money. But make sure you write this down in your notes. The real wealth is the ability to produce new things. Because if you have the ability to produce new things at a rapid rate and on a consistent basis, you would never be hurting for customers and clientele, and that will always keep you in business. For example, this is why Apple, Microsoft, most of the products that we currently are experiencing right now in 2020 was already built, tested, and approved for mass distribution and dissemination 10 years ago. All right, in Apple. All right. So usually their rule of thumb is to always have products that are available 10 years in advance. All right. So that way they're constantly in the format of producing new things to keep themselves in business. Okay. Now, an example of this in the Bible is actually Jacob. All right. Even though he was very wealthy, it wasn't because of the size of his flocks and herds, but it was because of the animals produced plenty of offspring each year to feed and clothe his growing family. Keep in mind, going back to section one, animal skins was prominent back then, as well as the meat that was utilized for edible purposes. All right. So really, cattle was very important back then. Now, the more a country produces each year, the more things its people can eat and enjoy that year, and the better prepared they can be to face the next year. Now, this is obviously referred to as the gross domestic product, which is what I echoed earlier, which is the most common measurement of a country's wealth. Make sure you write that down in your notes. You will need to know that. Now, when we're talking about the gross domestic product, let's kind of break this down briefly. The term gross simply means total. Okay. The total value of all products. Now, products refers to goods and services. All right. Made by domestic. Domestic referring to home or inside that respective country. All right, workers within one time period or one fiscal period. Now, the rule of thumb, usually the fiscal period is anywhere from October 1st for example, October 1st of 2020 to September 30th of 2021. That would be an example of a fiscal period. Okay. Now, the total GDP means very little until it's actually compared to the number of workers who produced those products. Now, let's go ahead and kind of break out the term that I introduced to you guys earlier called per capita GDP. Make sure you underline, write this down that the definition for per capita GDP is the average value of products produced by each person in the country. So it's one thing to have a great deal of products within your country, but it's another thing when you also have a certain number of workers who are in place in order to actively participate in the production of those products in order to keep the economy going. This measurement shows how a person is producing each year. Now, let's utilize one quick example of Bangladesh and Luxembourg. Okay. Now, if you notice, the population between Bangladesh and Luxembourg is not even a comparison. Bangladesh has over 144 million people, while Luxembourg is barely scratching the surface, all right, at a half a million. However, when you look at the GDP, right, the GDP in Bangladesh is 275.7 billion per year, compared to only 27 billion in Luxembourg. But that's not really the main number that we want to focus on. The real number is the per capita GDP. Bangladesh is only at $2,000 per person, while on average in Luxembourg, they're at $58,900 per person. All right. So this is kind of demonstrating to you guys a difference between GDP, all right, and per capita GDP. This is why when we're talking about per capita GDP, this is the most meaningful measure, all right, of how a country is doing within their economic system. Now, how do these countries distribute wealth amongst themselves? Well, when we're talking about development, going back to section one dealing with primary industries, all right, the effective use of raw materials, labor, and capital is simply called development. All right, economists actually have a way to measure the value that manufacturers add to raw materials. All right, an example of this would be if the original metals in a car are worth $500, all right, and the final car is worth $30,500, then the value added is 30,000. Okay, so the materials, the metals that are essential to the construction and manufacturing of the car is 500 bucks. All right, but the amount of labor that is infused into making that, turning those metals into a car, all right, is actually adding value to that particular entity. All right, this is where there's a $30,000 bump in its production. All right, so the United States is responsible for nearly one third of the world's value added by manufacture, all right, which results into roughly, on average, about $1 trillion per year. Make sure you highlight that, write that down. Development is so important because it translates into power. All right, this is why the concept of developed nations or developed countries is so key. All right, now there are 8 countries that produce more than 75% of all value added manufacturing. All right, they are called the Group of Eight or the G8. We hear the term G8 Summit. All right, this is a summit where the G8 members will meet together in order to kind of navigate the process of what kind of goods and services are trending within their native areas, and most importantly, what potential trade deals can be conducted between these respective countries. Okay. Now they have a wide range of industries that take full advantage of their people's skills. Now, believe it or not, as wonderful as China is when it comes to innovation, and several other nations as well, they're not necessarily included in the G8. Matter of fact, they have very high national GDPs and many factories, but they are considered developing countries. All right. So make sure you keep that in mind. Now, developing countries, countries who have high GDPs because of their large populations, but their per capita GDPs are very low. All right. Now, just because a country has a high GDP doesn't necessarily mean that their per capita is high. All right. We saw that example in Bangladesh and Luxembourg. All right. Now, the division of labor. All right. So make sure you bear this in mind. This is a very important section. All right. Within section four, or subsection, I should say. All right. Now, the division of labor really is a true marker of how developed a nation really is. So, the best evidence of a nation's development is its division of labor. So, make sure you write that down in your notes. Rather than working on farms, workers can choose from among hundreds of different occupations. Now, there are 3 main categories that we have to look at when we're talking about the division of labor. All right, we have to look at the agricultural aspect, industrial aspect, as well as the service aspect. In essence, you can look at most of the jobs that we see in today's society are primarily service based because these type of jobs can really only be provided by people, and service requires people. So therefore, this is where tertiary industries are more commonplace and more connected to um, this element or division of labor. Okay, so make sure you highlight that, write that down. Now, as we begin to close, this is where countries begin to become very territorial, okay, in their conduction of trade. Now, some countries have tried to achieve economic self sufficiency. All right, make sure you highlight that, write that term down, and the definition after it, which is the ability to produce everything they need without buying or selling from other countries. Now, we have to remember that trading is not a bad thing. In fact, it was actually something that is created by God. All right. For example, Israel, under the rule of Solomon, enjoyed extensive trade with surrounding nations. Why? Because Solomon had so much access to an abundance of natural resources that he began to share and trade with other nations, which made Israel so profitable during that time period. Now, throughout history, nations have depended on trade to acquire from others the raw materials that they lack. For example, as much of a superpower as the United States has been for a while, though we're rich in resources, we must actually import 100% of our bauxite, our manganese, and check this out, graphite. Okay, these three elements are so essential. All right, especially when we begin to also look at elements such as diamonds, platinum, tungsten, chromium, tin, nickel. All of these elements, when combined together, actually are essential in the construction of major transportation devices such as airplanes and other critical industries are really in demand for that. Because without these metals, we would not necessarily be able to produce cars, we wouldn't be able to produce airplanes, and we would really be um, negatively impacted on the transportation end of our goods and services. Okay, so make sure you bear that in mind. Now, this is where we see the term market come into the fold. We briefly touched on free market earlier, all right? But when we're talking about market, this is simply where people or businesses are in place to buy its products. All right. Now, obviously, these products are made accessible through exports and imports. So, exports is the primary and secondary goods that a country ships to other countries. All right. And imports are all the goods that a country receives from other countries. In fact, the United States of America, we're one of the only superpowers right now that actually imports more than we export. Okay. Now, occasionally countries have disputes over trade. Sometimes those conflicts lead to a war, but make sure you put a pin in this, all right? But countries have other weapons at their disposal. This is where we see tariffs, taxes on imports and exports, and trading embargoes, okay? A ban on importing or exporting goods, okay? For example, the United States can place an embargo on a country, all right? And then that embargo in turn will provide a significant dent, all right, in that particular country's economy. Why? Because their economic base is so largely dependent upon their trading deal and the products that are traded with the United States and the money that they receive in exchange for it. All right. They're so dependent on the United States until eventually they will have to concede, all right, and submit, all right, to the United States and their demands if they want to renegotiate a trade deal with them. All right. This is why President Trump, when he was running for president, one of the first things that he was talking about was the renegotiation of trade deals. All right. That concludes section 4, and that also concludes chapter 3. All right. Good job. Way to hang in there. Make sure you stay on top of your notes. Make sure you answer all questions that are attached to the puzzle. Be on the lookout for a little review session as well as a study guide in preparation for your upcoming test, which will be next week. Take care. God bless. Talk to you soon.